You don't belong here. Johnny heard the whisper in the wind as he rode into the quiet town. He'd heard the stories, of course. The tales of the Apache, fierce, proud, and untouchable. But nothing could prepare him for the moment his eyes fell on her. Nehimana. She stood in the middle of the dusty street, as though she'd been waiting for him. Her dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto his with a gaze that both chilled and intrigued him. She wasn't like the others. Not the men who looked at her with hatred or the women who whispered behind her back. Nehimana stood tall and defiant, her black hair cascading down her back in thick waves, her movements like the wind itself, fluid and powerful. He was a cowboy, a rancher, born and raised in the heart of the West, and yet something about her presence made his chest tighten. He couldn't quite place it, but he knew he'd never felt this way before. Johnny pulled his horse to a slow stop just a few paces away. His hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side, though he didn't expect any trouble. Nehimana didn't seem like a threat, but then again, he hadn't met many women like her. "Touch me, and you'll know my secret," she whispered, her voice low, almost like a challenge. It wasn't the words themselves that struck him. It was the way she said them, calm, yet daring. He hesitated, unsure of what to make of it. "What's your secret?" Johnny asked, though he knew he shouldn't have. She didn't answer right away, instead studying him like she was trying to read every line of his face. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The tension between them was palpable, the kind that makes your heart race even when you don't know why. Nehimana stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his, and for the first time, Johnny felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in years. "I'm not like the others," she said finally, her voice carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for someone standing so still. "I have a past, one you wouldn't understand." Johnny's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked, though part of him was afraid to know the answer. Nehimana's lips pressed into a thin line, and she took a step back, as if unsure whether to reveal more. "I'm not just Apache," she said softly. "I am the daughter of someone you might have known." The words hit him harder than any bullet. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she said it made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like a warning, though he wasn't sure what it was warning him about. Johnny found himself at a crossroads, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. He'd spent years building his life out here, away from the noise and complications of the world. And now, standing in front of this woman, he felt like everything he knew was suddenly uncertain. "I don't know who you think I am," Johnny began, his voice steady, but his heart was thudding in his chest. "But I'm not some man who will," Nehimana cut him off. "You don't have to be. I'm not asking for your help. But don't make the mistake of thinking you understand me. Or my people." Johnny swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in. "And what if I don't care about your people?" he asked, trying to sound confident, though he wasn't sure he could handle the truth of it. Nehimana's gaze softened, and for a moment, Johnny saw a flicker of something more than anger in her eyes. "Then you'll never understand the secret I'm hiding," she said. Johnny didn't know what to say. He couldn't understand it. What could she be hiding that would make her so certain that it was a secret only someone like him could uncover? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't a chance encounter. Nehimana was a puzzle, one that he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he tried. He watched her for a moment longer, the silence between them stretching out. Then, as if some invisible line had been drawn, Nehimana turned and started to walk away, her figure fading into the shadows of the town. "Wait," Johnny called, but she didn't turn around. He had to know. He had to understand. Something told him that his life, and maybe his future, depended on the answer she had yet to give. Johnny stood there for a moment, watching Nehimana walk away. His heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had to understand. The secret she held, it tugged at him like a rope, pulling him forward, even though he barely knew her. He wasn't the type to chase after something he didn't understand, but something about her was different. Something about this felt like fate. Without thinking, he spurred his horse forward, the sound of hooves echoing in the quiet town as he followed her. Nehimana didn't look back, but Johnny could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew he was behind her. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and Johnny couldn't ignore the pull between them any longer. He caught up to her just as she reached the edge of town. "Nehimana," he called, his voice firm but unsure. She stopped, her back still turned to him. For a long moment, There was only silence, the wind rustling the dry leaves around them. Then, without turning to face him, she spoke. "What do you want, cowboy?" Her voice was steady, but Johnny could hear the guarded edge to it. He swallowed, unsure of what to say, but he couldn't hold back any longer. "I need to know," he began, his voice softer now, "what you're hiding. Why did you say that? Why the secret?" She slowly turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if deciding how much to reveal. Johnny held his breath, waiting for her to speak. "You're not ready to hear it," she said quietly, her tone almost wistful. "Some things, they're not meant for men like you." Johnny's frustration grew. "You don't know me," he shot back, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can handle the truth." Nehimana took a deep breath, her gaze softening just a little. "You think you can," she said, stepping closer to him. "But some truths are heavier than you realize. It's not just about you and me. It's about everything. Everything that came before us. My people, your people. This land we're standing on. It's all tangled up in a history you won't understand unless you see it with my eyes." Johnny's mind raced. He could feel the weight of her words, but it only made him more determined to know the truth. "Then show me," he said, his voice low, full of conviction. "I'm not going to walk away from this." Nehimana studied him for a long moment, and Johnny felt the weight of her gaze, as if she were looking into his soul, searching for something, or perhaps testing him. Finally, she nodded, a single, slow movement. "Follow me," she said simply. Johnny's heart pounded as he followed her through the town, out into the wilderness. The quiet night surrounded them, the sound of crickets and distant animals filling the air. Nehimana led him to a small clearing, where the moonlight bathed the land in silver. She stopped at the edge of a small creek, the water flowing gently over rocks. "This is where it all started," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the water. Johnny looked at her, confused. "What started?" She turned to him, her face solemn. "The story of my people. And yours." Johnny felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know what she meant, but he could feel it. The weight of history was here, in this place, in her words. Nehimana stepped closer to the creek, kneeling down to touch the water with her fingers. "This land," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "was once shared in peace. But that peace was broken, and the scars it left go deeper than you think. The blood of my ancestors, the blood of your ancestors, it's all still here. And we're all paying the price for it." Johnny stood there, frozen, as the weight of her words sank in. He wanted to speak, to ask more, but he couldn't. There was something in her voice, something in the air, that told him this was only the beginning. Nehimana stood up, meeting his gaze once more. "You wanted to know my secret," she said, her tone grave. "But are you ready to face it?" Johnny didn't have an answer. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. Johnny looked at Nehimana, his heart pounding in his chest. Her words still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the weight of the history they shared. He had followed her to this creek, but it was more than just a place. It was the beginning of something far deeper, far more complicated than anything he had ever known. Nehimana was right. He had no idea what he was getting into. "What do you mean?" Johnny finally asked, his voice hoarse. Nehimana's gaze didn't leave the water, but he could see the pain in her eyes. "You're asking about my secret," she said. "But the truth isn't something you can just learn overnight. It's a part of who I am, a part of what this land has witnessed for generations." Johnny felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known the history of his people and the Apache, but this felt different. "You mean the past?" he asked, stepping closer to her. Nehimana nodded slowly. "The past isn't just something that happened. It's alive, Johnny. It's in the earth, in the air, in everything we do." She finally turned to face him, her dark eyes filled with sorrow and strength. "The land remembers everything. Every wound, every injustice. And it never forgets." Johnny took a step back, his mind racing. The words were heavy, too heavy for him to fully understand. But he knew one thing for certain. Nehimana wasn't just talking about ancient history. She was talking about something much more personal, something that tied her to the land in a way that he couldn't grasp. "So what does that mean for us?" Johnny asked, his voice quieter now. Nehimana took a deep breath and walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. "It means that there are things we can't change," she said, her voice steady. "Things that are beyond us. but it also means we have the power to make things right, even if it's just for ourselves. Johnny swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had come here hoping to understand her, to understand the secret she was hiding. But now, it seemed like there was no easy answer. There was no simple way to fix the past. You think we can make things right? Johnny asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nehimana nodded, her gaze softening. I don't know, she said, but I do know that we can try. We can start by being honest with each other, by not pretending that the past doesn't matter. Johnny felt a lump form in his throat. He had never been good at facing the past. He had always been the type to move forward, to keep going no matter what. But Nehimana was asking him to do something different. She was asking him to confront the very thing he had been running from. And what if the truth is too much to bear? Johnny asked, his voice raw. Nehimana's eyes searched his face, as if weighing his very soul. Then we face it together, she said softly. Johnny didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to turn away, to ride off and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to Nehimana, wanted to stay. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he cared. Nehimana stepped closer, her presence warm and steady. You're not alone, Johnny, she said. You never have been. The words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he felt something inside him shift. It wasn't just the weight of her words. It was the promise they held. The promise of something more, something real. Johnny looked at her, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever this was, he couldn't walk away now. Not when the past was still calling. Not when Nehimana was standing in front of him, offering him a chance to face it all. Okay, Johnny said, his voice steady. Together. Nehimana nodded, her eyes softening with a hint of a smile. Then let's begin. Johnny followed Nehimana deeper into the wilderness, his mind still racing with the weight of their conversation. Every word she had spoken felt like a stone, pressing down on his chest, but there was a part of him that couldn't deny the truth in her voice. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the air thick with the quiet hum of nature, until they reached a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Nehimana stopped in the center of the clearing, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Johnny could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something was about to unfold. This is where it happened, Nehimana said, her voice soft but steady. Johnny looked around, not sure what she meant. Where what happened? He asked. Nehimana knelt down beside a large rock, her fingers brushing against the surface as if she were tracing something. Where my father was killed, she said quietly, her eyes distant. Johnny's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. He had known Nehimana's past was tangled with pain, but he hadn't expected it to be so close to where they stood. I never knew my father, she continued, her voice almost a whisper. But I know this land, and it remembers everything. It remembers his blood, the moment he fell, the moment it all changed. Johnny swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. He had heard stories about the Apache and their connection to the land, but hearing it from Nehimana, feeling the weight of her words, made it real in a way he hadn't imagined. You think you can change it? He asked, his voice soft. Nehimana looked up at him, her gaze sharp. I don't know, she said, but I can try, and so can you. Johnny stepped closer, his heart heavy with the realization that this wasn't just about understanding Nehimana anymore. It was about understanding the land, the history, and the cost of everything that had come before them. I'll stand by you, he said, his voice firm. Nehimana nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to say those words. Then let's make it right, she said. Johnny didn't fully understand what that meant, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Nehimana stood up, dusting off her hands. The past is not something you can outrun, she said. It follows you, but you can learn from it. You can move forward. Johnny felt the weight of her words, the responsibility in them. He had always believed that moving forward meant leaving the past behind, but now, he understood. The past didn't let you go. It shaped who you were, who you could become. Nehimana turned to him, her expression softer now. I don't know what the future holds, she said. But together, maybe we can find a way. Johnny looked at her, the woman who had become his anchor, his guide into a world he had never truly seen. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would face whatever came next. Johnny and Nehimana spent the next few days moving through the land, each step bringing them closer to understanding, even though the weight of the past still lingered in the air. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken bond that had begun to form. As they traveled, Johnny learned more about Nehimana's people, about the struggles they had faced, and the strength they had gained through hardship. It wasn't just the land they shared. It was the deep, enduring connection to everything around them. It was a bond that Johnny had never fully understood, but now, he was beginning to see its power. One evening, as they set up camp by a quiet river, Nehimana looked at him with a look that seemed to hold years of untold stories. "You don't have to understand everything all at once," she said softly, her voice steady. "But you do have to listen." Johnny nodded, the fire crackling softly between them. "I'm listening," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even him. Nehimana gave a small, knowing smile. "Then that's all we need for now." As the days passed, Johnny found himself falling into a rhythm with Nehimana. The way she moved through the world, with purpose and grace, was a stark contrast to the hurried, often reckless way he had lived. She didn't rush to answer every question, didn't feel the need to explain every detail of her life. She let the land speak for itself, and Johnny was learning to listen. One morning, as they were walking along a narrow trail that wound through the trees, Nehimana stopped suddenly, her hand held up in a silent gesture for him to stop. Johnny did, his heart quickening slightly at the sudden shift in her demeanor. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice low and serious. Johnny looked around, but there was no immediate danger in sight. "Feel what?" he asked, confused. Nehimana's gaze was fixed ahead, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The air is changing. Something is coming." Johnny stood still, his senses heightening. He didn't know what Nehimana could feel that he couldn't, but he trusted her instincts. He had learned to. They continued on the path, the sense of something hanging in the air growing stronger with each step. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken, a storm brewing in the distance. Nehimana quickened her pace, and Johnny followed her lead, the sense of urgency growing. By the time the storm hit, they had found shelter in a small cave on the side of the hill. The wind howled outside, and rain began to pour down in sheets. As they sat in the quiet darkness of the cave, Nehimana spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You're not the only one who has a past, Johnny," she said, her words lingering in the air between them. Johnny turned to face her, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Nehimana met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "There are things in my past that I can't escape, things that will always be a part of me. But it's not just my burden to carry anymore. You're a part of this now, too." Johnny felt the weight of her words, but he didn't flinch. "I'm with you, Nehimana. Whatever it is, whatever it takes. We'll face it together." Nehimana's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't speak for a long time. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave, it was quiet. It was a different kind of silence, one that felt like the calm before something much bigger. Johnny didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And whatever Nehimana's past held, whatever secrets it held, they were in this together now. The storm had passed by the time they emerged from the cave. The world outside washed clean under the fading light of the evening. Johnny stretched, feeling the cool air on his skin, the tension in his muscles easing after hours of being confined in the small shelter. Nehimana stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. There was something about the way she stood, so still and focused, that made Johnny feel as though she was connected to the land in a way he could never understand. "You're thinking about what comes next, aren't you?" Johnny asked, stepping closer to her. Nehimana didn't turn to him, but her lips curved into the slightest of smiles. "Always," she said quietly. "It's not just the land I'm thinking about. It's us." Johnny frowned. "Us?" Nehimana nodded, still not looking at him. "This," she said, gesturing to the vast landscape around them, "is where our story begins. But it's also where it could end. And that's something I need you to understand." Johnny felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew Nehimana had a past, but this was different. There was a finality in her voice, a weight that told him she wasn't just talking about the journey they had taken so far. She was talking about something much bigger. "What do you mean?" he asked. Nehimana turned to face him then, her expression more serious than he had ever seen it. "This land," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "was once a place of peace. It was where my people lived freely, where we were one with the earth. But that peace was shattered, and the scars left behind are still here. In the land, in the air, in everything we see." Johnny took a step forward, feeling the weight of her words, the way they hung in the air like an unspoken promise. "And where do we fit into all of this?" he asked. Nehimana's eyes locked onto his, her gaze unwavering. "You've already become part of it," she said. Johnny wasn't sure what to say. He had come to this land, to this journey, hoping to understand Nehimana, hoping to understand what lay between them. But now, it seemed like there was so much more at stake than just their relationship. There was the land, the history, and the burden of everything that had happened before them. "I never thought it would be this complicated," Johnny said, his voice low. "I didn't either," Nehimana replied, her tone quieter now, as if she were revealing something private. "But sometimes the weight of the past is heavier than we realize. And if we don't face it, it will drag us down." Johnny reached out, his hand brushing against hers, the touch a small but meaningful connection. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Nehimana looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read something in him. Finally, she spoke. "We face it together," she said, her voice steady. "We face the past, and whatever comes next, we face it side by side." Johnny nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. For the first time, he understood what she meant. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everything that had come before them, everything that had shaped this land and its people. And if they were going to move forward, they had to face it together. "I'm with you," Johnny said, his voice full of determination. Nehimana smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her in days. "Then let's make sure the past doesn't decide our future," she said. And with that, they began their journey again, the road ahead uncertain, but their path together clear. Johnny and Nehimana continued their journey, each step taking them further into a land that was both strange and familiar to them. As they walked, the silence between them grew comfortable, but Johnny could sense that Nehimana was still carrying the weight of something much heavier than what they had already faced. The days were growing longer, the sun beating down on them relentlessly as they made their way through the dry, dusty trails. They didn't speak much, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had begun to form without words. Johnny had learned more about Nehimana's past, about the history of her people, but there were still pieces she hadn't shared. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the full truth, but he knew it was coming. As they approached the base of a mountain, Nehimana suddenly stopped, her hand lifting to silence Johnny. He looked at her, sensing something was off. Her eyes were fixed on the path ahead, her expression unreadable. "What is it?" Johnny asked, his voice low. Nehimana didn't answer immediately. She stood there, her posture tense, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Johnny followed her line of sight, but saw nothing. "We're being watched," Nehimana said, her voice barely a whisper. Johnny's heart skipped a beat. He had been so focused on their journey that he hadn't considered the danger that might still be out there, waiting for them. "By who?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle at his side. Nehimana shook her head slowly. "I'm not sure, but we need to be careful." They continued to move forward cautiously, the tension thick in the air. Johnny's eyes darted around, scanning the trees and rocks, but there was nothing. The feeling of being watched lingered, but it was impossible to pinpoint the source. Nehimana led him to a small clearing by the edge of the mountain. The trees around them were thick, their branches heavy with leaves, casting long shadows on the ground. "We'll rest here for a while," Nehimana said, her voice steady. Johnny nodded, though his mind was still racing. He had been through dangerous situations before, but something about this felt different. Nehimana set down her pack and began gathering firewood, but her movements were quick, efficient, as if she were preparing for something. Johnny watched her, feeling a mix of admiration and concern. There was so much he didn't understand, so much he still needed to learn about her and the world she came from. "What's going on, Nehimana?" Johnny asked, his voice soft. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, and then she spoke. "There are things in this world that can't be seen, Johnny," she said, her tone serious. "Things that exist in the spaces between the living and the dead. My people have always known how to move through these spaces, to listen to the land and the spirits that watch over it. Johnny's brow furrowed. Spirits. Nehimana nodded slowly. The spirits of my ancestors are always near, watching over us, guiding us. They protect us, but they also warn us when danger is close. Johnny didn't know what to say. He had always believed in what he could see, in what he could touch and feel. But Nehimana's words, the way she said them, made him question everything. You believe in them? He asked, his voice low. Nehimana looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I have to, she said softly. It's how I survive. Johnny sat down beside her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He didn't know if he believed in spirits, but he knew one thing for sure. He believed in Nehimana. He believed in her strength, in the way she had carried herself through everything she had faced. And now, more than ever, he knew that whatever they were about to face, they would face it together. The fire crackled in the quiet of the clearing, the night growing darker around them. Johnny leaned back, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew that with Nehimana by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Johnny and Nehimana packed up their camp quietly, the sky still dark with the remnants of the storm that had passed through. The land around them was calm, but the tension lingered, a subtle reminder that danger was never far. Nehimana seemed to be listening to something Johnny couldn't hear, her eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for something to emerge from the wilderness. He followed her lead, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. They moved through the dense forest, the air cool and crisp, but it wasn't long before Johnny started to feel like they were being watched again. He didn't know if it was just his imagination or something Nehimana had sensed, but there was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. Do you feel it? Johnny asked, his voice low. Nehimana didn't answer immediately, but she nodded, her expression focused. It's close, she said, barely above a whisper. We're being followed. Johnny tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Who? He asked, his mind racing. Nehimana shook her head. I don't know yet, she replied. But it's not just the land we have to worry about. Johnny felt his pulse quicken. He had been through enough skirmishes and dangers in his life to know that fear could cloud your judgment. But there was something about Nehimana's calm demeanor that kept him from panicking. She had a way of facing danger that made him feel like everything would be okay, even if they didn't know what was coming. They moved deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser as the path narrowed. Nehimana's steps were silent, and Johnny found himself mirroring her movements, trying to match her fluidity. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. And then, just as Johnny thought they might be overreacting, a rustling noise broke the silence. Nehimana's body went rigid, her hand held up to signal for him to stop. Johnny froze, his eyes scanning the area ahead. There, emerging from the shadows, were three figures, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. Johnny's heart skipped a beat. Nehimana stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We know you're there, she called out, her words cutting through the air like a blade. There's no need for hiding. The figures paused, as if deciding whether to reveal themselves. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, one of them spoke, his voice gruff and low. We've been watching you, he said, stepping into the dim light. His face was weathered, scarred from years of surviving the harsh landscape. We know what you're after. Johnny's hand instinctively tightened around the rifle, but Nehimana placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. We're not after anything, she said. We're simply passing through. The man laughed, the sound rough and bitter. You think it's that simple? He asked. You think you can just walk away from the past? Nehimana's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Johnny saw something in her he hadn't seen before, a raw, unfiltered anger. The past is not something you can control, she said, her voice steady. It's what makes us who we are, and I will face it when I am ready. The man didn't move, but Johnny could feel the tension between them, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. You think you're the only ones with a past? The man spat. You think you're the only ones with something to prove? Nehimana stood tall, her gaze unwavering. I don't need to prove anything, she said, her voice firm. I've already faced more than most people could ever imagine, and I will face what comes next on my terms. The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped back, his companions following his lead. "We'll see," he muttered before disappearing back into the shadows. Johnny exhaled, his muscles relaxing as the immediate danger passed. Nehimana didn't say anything as she turned back to him, but her eyes were distant, as if she were still processing everything that had just happened. "What was that all about?" Johnny asked, his voice quieter now. Nehimana looked at him, her expression softening. "There are people who want to keep the past buried," she said. "And there are people who want to use it to control others." Johnny nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Nehimana took a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice steady again. "The past can wait, but we can't." Johnny nodded, following her into the unknown, knowing that whatever awaited them, they would face it as one. As Johnny and Nehimana pressed forward, the land around them grew even more rugged, the terrain growing steep and uneven beneath their boots. The sky was overcast, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and rain, though the storm had long passed. Every step felt like they were nearing something they couldn't quite see yet, and the silence between them felt heavy, laden with unspoken words. Johnny had learned to trust Nehimana, to trust her instincts, but the lingering sense of danger from the previous encounter weighed on him. They didn't talk much as they moved, both lost in their thoughts, their footsteps synchronized like a quiet dance. The further they traveled, the more Johnny realized that Nehimana wasn't just leading him through the wilderness. She was leading them through something much deeper, something he wasn't fully ready to understand, but knew he had no choice but to follow. It was as if the land itself was calling to her, guiding her towards something. She stopped suddenly, her hand raised in a signal for him to halt. Johnny felt his heart quicken, sensing that something was about to change. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nehimana turned to him, her face a mask of calm. "We're getting close," she said softly, her voice almost inaudible against the wind. "I can feel it." Johnny didn't ask what she meant. He knew better by now. Instead, he nodded, his gaze scanning the horizon, trying to see what Nehimana saw. In the distance, a faint shadow seemed to hover against the edge of the mountains, an outline of something large and looming. Johnny's breath caught in his chest, and he felt an uneasy chill creep down his spine. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice tight. Nehimana nodded, her eyes fixed on the shadow. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "It's the place where everything changed. The place where we can finally face the past." Johnny's mind raced, 1,000 questions rushing to the forefront of his thoughts, but he didn't ask them. Instead, he followed Nehimana as she started toward the distant silhouette, her steps sure and measured. As they drew closer, the figure began to take shape, a massive stone structure, weathered and ancient, its walls covered in moss and vines. It looked like something out of a forgotten legend, a monument to a time long past. Johnny felt a sense of awe wash over him as they approached. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Nehimana stopped just before the entrance, her eyes scanning the stone with reverence. "This is where my people once gathered," she said quietly. "Where we made decisions, where we honored our ancestors. It's been lost to time, but it's still here, still waiting for us." Johnny took in the sight before him, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He didn't know what it was about this place that made it feel so important, so significant, but he could sense that Nehimana was right. They had reached something profound, something that held the key to understanding everything that had brought them to this point. Nehimana stepped forward, her hand resting gently on the stone. "This is where we must face it all," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Johnny watched her, unsure of what she meant, but there was something in her gaze that told him this was the moment she had been leading them toward. He stepped beside her, his hand hovering over the stone. As his fingers brushed against the surface, a strange energy seemed to pulse beneath his touch. It was as if the stone was alive, as if it had been waiting for them. Johnny looked at Nehimana, his heart pounding in his chest. "What now?" he asked. Nehimana turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Now," she said softly, "we listen. The past has been speaking to us all along. It's time we heard what it has to say." Johnny felt a shiver run down his spine as the wind picked up around them, the air charged with an unseen presence. He didn't know what to expect, But he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just walking through the land. They were walking through the echoes of history, and whatever lay ahead, they would face